Okay. Good morning to many of you. Good afternoon to some. My name's Nick Hermalik, and I'm so excited to be with you all. We're going to kick off right at 10 o'clock. Sorry, 10 o'clock Central. I'll go explain that. 8 a.m. Pacific. Right now, just to start with some housekeeping and brief introductions, because we just have a lot of great speakers planned for all of you, and we want to allow plenty of time for a robust roundtable discussion. So we're going to get started. Just as way of introduction, my name is Nick Hermalik. I'm a climate change policy advisor based in the British Consulate General in Chicago. This is where I lead our UK's COP26 engagement efforts in the Midwest. And I should pause just to say that COP26 is the next international climate conference that will be held in Glasgow, Scotland in November 2021. And so this event is one of a series of drumbeats that the UK is hosting as we head to next November. And so I'm so excited to be here because I also lead the UK's COP26 nature campaign here in the United States, which is why I'm excited to be moderating today's Blue Tech Week Roundtable. So welcome everyone. Just two housekeeping items. A couple things. One, we do want to at the start of the hour let everyone know that we are recording this, and so that will be posted online at a later date, but wanted everyone aware that we are recording. And also a reminder for everyone to please mute and keep your screen off, especially for the next 30 minutes when our keynote speaker and speakers give their brief presentations. At that point, after we're done with that, I will go through some logistics on how our facilitated roundtable discussion will work. So again, please remember to mute and keep your screen off, especially for the next 30 minutes. And with that, I think we're ready to get started. So to kick things off, I'm pleased to introduce Her Majesty's Consul General for the Southwest region, Emily Cloak. Emily has a range of policy, commercial, and international experience working for the British government. She's held several senior trade-related roles, but has also past experience advising on the creation of the world's first green investment bank. So excited to hand off to you, Emily.
Violence. Hello, my brother gave me your number.
Thank you so much. I'm just putting on my camera, but it's taking a little bit of time with the technology.
Of course.
Okay, my camera won't turn on, but I'll start and hopefully it will mid remarks. So thank you so much. My name is Emily Cloak and I am the British Consul General newly arrived in Los Angeles covering the broader Southwest. This is the 4th consecutive year that we, the consulate in Los Angeles and the UK government office in San Diego have supported Blue Tech Week. And we would like to thank TMA Blue Tech for being wonderful partners over the years. Thank you to everyone for participating today. I think it'll be a really wonderful discussion. I'll say a little bit firstly just about the UK and US relationship because we work so closely together. We are each other's biggest investors, and the UK and US in that way create high-skilled jobs and facilitate growth in our respective economies. Every morning, 1.3 million people, we estimate, get up and go to work for British companies in the US, and 1.7 million people in Britain do the same for American companies. And yesterday, I hear that Innovate UK spoke at Blue Tech Week and gave examples of UK and US businesses working together on areas like offshore wind technologies. So what we do together is really, really strong. As has been mentioned, we're here today to talk about the importance of COP26 and to tackle climate change and move as many countries, companies and subnational groups as possible towards net zero emissions, and specifically the role of nature-based solutions. And I'm proud to say that tackling climate change is a really key priority for the UK government. And just this week, our Prime Minister announced a UK Green Industrial Revolution, a 10-point plan to accelerate the transition to net zero, and demonstrating really the UK's belief that low carbon growth will be the most effective form of sustainable recovery. And we think that this plan will help mobilise around $16 billion of new investment in the UK and up to 250,000 new jobs. And just to illustrate some of the points of this plan, it includes ending the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. So that's 10 years earlier than previously, and puts the UK on course to be the first G7 country to decarbonise road transport. It includes protecting and restoring the natural environment, including planting 30,000 hectares of trees every year. And it also includes Jet Zero and greener maritime, so supporting difficult to decarbonise industries to become greener through research projects for zero emission planes and ships. It's wonderful to see so many innovators here with us today working on nature-based solutions, and we've got a fantastic spread of companies with us doing innovative things from novel ways of harvesting crops through to natural coastal defences and algae technologies. We're also joined by a variety of experts as well. So I'm really privileged to introduce Lord Goldsmith, our Minister of State for the Pacific and the Environment, and a passionate environmentalist. So I will pass on now to the Minister. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Really good to be here, and I'm going to apologise in advance. I'm not in my normal office. I'm between meetings, so you might hear a lot of swearing from the street outside, in which case I apologise. It's very, very good to be here, and thanks for that intro, Emily. If it weren't for the pandemic, today we'd likely already be reflecting on the UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming in China. We'd be beginning to welcome the world to COP26 in Glasgow, which, as you know, we're co-hosting with Italy. That was the plan, and it all seems like a different world now. And I think in many respects it is a different world. Coronavirus has really changed everything. It is itself more than likely the consequence of our abuse of nature, but we also know that it will be dwarfed by the impacts of climate breakdown and environmental degradation, both on land and in our ocean. So we need to hope that the pandemic is taken as the warning that I think it is, because we cannot reasonably expect to be able to destroy the natural world in the way that we are, at the rate that we are, without paying a terrible price. And there is no doubt that that's what we're doing. We learnt a fortnight ago that 2/5 of the world's plants are facing extinction. And that's twice what we thought just 4 years before that. We've learnt that populations of key species have declined by nearly 70% since 1970. A flicker from evolutionary point of view, that 1 million species face extinction. We're losing a grotesque 30 football pitches worth of tropical forest every single minute. And I think it's easy to become immune somehow to these statistics because we just hear so many of them. So let me put it another way. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. If we scale that back to 1 year, humans have been around for less than 1 hour. Our industrial revolution began less than 1 minute ago, and in under 1 second, we've destroyed more than half the world's tropical forest. Well, it goes without saying that another second like that, and it's game over. Not just for the 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity that lives in forests, or the billion people who depend directly on forests, but all of us. We all depend profoundly on forests for air to breathe, food, resources, medicines, trade, functioning climate, functioning water systems. And to make matters worse, deforestation and land use change has also become the second biggest contributor to climate change. And what we're doing to land is mirrored in the ocean, where life began. Like our forests, we all ultimately depend on ocean health. But for some, that importance is much more direct and immediate. Over 1 billion people, for instance, depend on fish for their survival, yet we're pushing the world's great fisheries to the brink. The world's coral reefs, on which 1/4 of marine species rely, are predicted to die off almost entirely in our warmer, more acidic seas. 1/3 of marine mammals are threatened with extinction. Almost 2/3 of our coastal wetlands are degraded. Critical habitat for migratory species, and half the world's seabird species are already affected by the rising tide of ocean plastic. Nowhere is spared, not even the deepest part of the ocean or uninhabited Henderson Island, 3,500 miles away from anyone. When ecosystems fail, along with the many free services nature provides, it's the world's poorest who suffer first and worst, because they're most likely to depend on those services. So turning this trajectory around is without a doubt the most important challenge we face by far. The pandemic has claimed over 1 million lives, and the fallout has battered every economy on Earth, including even those small island states that somehow avoided the virus itself. This sort of economic carnage is global. But if there's a silver lining, it's that we have an opportunity now to do things differently. We're all going to have to rebuild our economies, and we can do so in a way that is both greener and better. Not just in a box-ticking sense, it means making sustainability the lens through which all decisions are made. And to some extent, that is already happening in relation to carbon. The cost of renewables has tumbled. Zero emissions vehicles are on the cusp of going mainstream. The market in so many respects is racing ahead of the politics. In some cases, it's racing ahead in spite of the politics. I mean, who would have predicted that the cost of solar, for instance, would have fallen 90% since the banking crisis 12 years ago? Now, I'm not suggesting complacency. Clearly we need to ramp things up. And that's why as presidents of COP26, we're asking countries to ramp up their ambitions. But when it comes to attaching a value to nature at a cost to its destruction, we've got to be honest about the fact that we've got a very, very long way still to go. And that has to change, because technology alone is not going to save the day. Yes, it has a big role to play, of course. Satellite mapping, monitoring, for instance, is going to be key. Like the world's first deep satellite tag with a crush depth of 6,000 meters, which shows us how St. Helena's marine protected areas help endangered whale sharks. So technology has a big role to play, but on its own, that technological transition is not nearly enough. Simply, there is no pathway to tackling climate change or preventing poverty or reversing biodiversity loss that does not involve protecting and conserving nature on a massive, unprecedented scale. Now, we know that nature-based solutions like woodlands and peatland could provide 1/3 of the most cost-effective solutions that we need to mitigate climate change, as well as helping species recover and helping communities to adapt to become more resilient to the inevitable change, storm surges, flooding, drought, deadly heat waves, and so on. But despite that huge contribution that nature can make, nature-based solutions currently receive less than 3% of the total global climate finance. And it just makes no sense at all. So as part of our COP presidency, we're asking countries to step up with nature finance. In the UK, we've committed to doubling our international climate finance, and we've committed that a major part of the uplift will be spent on nature. But public money is great, but it's not enough. We know the problem is too big for that. So in addition to increasing direct government support for nature, we also need governments to identify and deploy all the levers at their disposal to shift the incentives away from destruction towards sustainability. So an example of that, the top 50 food producing countries in the world pay out around $700 billion a year in agricultural, often destructive land use subsidies. That's every year, and it's about 4 times the world's annual aid budget combined. In the UK, we're using our new independence post-Brexit to switch our subsidy system away from the one that we were required to adhere to a new one that rewards farmers for good stewardship of the land. In fact, the public money that will be dished out will be conditional upon good stewardship of the land. And if we can persuade other countries to do similarly, we have the potential to flip the market in favor of forests and ecosystems. Last week, we also announced that we're introducing a new law that will require bigger businesses operating in the UK to remove illegal deforestation from their supply chains. I believe it's a world first. And again, if we can build an alliance of countries committed to working with us to clean the global supply chains, we can turn those destructive incentives around. And we need massive efforts around ocean protection as well. There's only so long that the ocean can continue to act as a buffer to climate change. It's already absorbed a quarter of carbon emissions and 90% of the excess heat caused by human activity. Last year, we launched the Global Ocean Alliance of countries committed to protecting at least 30% of the world's ocean by 2030. We have 30 countries on board so far. I understand California has made a similar commitment for its sea and land. Our own Blue Belt program of marine protected areas around our beautiful overseas territories has grown to protect an area larger than India. And only a few days ago, last week, we jointly announced with Tristan da Cunha Islanders, an island in the South Atlantic, a new marine protected area 3 times the size of the UK. And early next year, the UK is set to launch a new £500 million Blue Planet Fund to help eligible countries around the world reduce poverty and support marine recovery and protection, including tackling the scourge of plastic pollution. Now, we think that now is the time to start negotiating a new global agreement to coordinate action on marine plastic litter and microplastic, one that goes far beyond existing frameworks. It has the potential, if we get it right, to create unstoppable momentum, just in the way the Paris Agreement has done for climate change and the Montreal Protocol has done for ozone-depleting chemicals. The market is the most powerful force for change of all, other than nature itself. But until the market learns to value the natural world and put a price on its destruction, that power, that awesome power, will drive destruction. And I think that's the biggest challenge we face. But facing it isn't a choice, it is a duty. A few weeks ago, world leaders gathered for a virtual UN General Assembly. 80 world leaders and 50 non-state actors signed an ambitious Leaders' Pledge for Nature, one of the most ambitious, if not the most ambitious, such declaration ever. And it was a commitment to put nature and biodiversity on a road to recovery by 2030. The challenge now, of course, is to take those words and turn them into meaningful action. The UK will do everything we can, but we can only do so in partnership. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Lord Goldsmith. Excellent remarks, and I was very the many things you touch struck by that statistic about only 3% of current global financing going towards nature-based solutions, even though we know there's so much potential in nature to combat climate change. So definitely something to focus on, but also as you noted, the UK is really leading the way, both with public dollars and through our leadership across the globe. So thank you for those remarks. So turning now to the next part of our program, and I should say that we want to encourage those of you with us to use the chat function to post questions as they come to you. We'll get to sort of the interactive part after we give our speakers a chance to sort of tee up the conversation with short presentations, but please feed in those questions as they come to you. I'd hate for you to forget and as you hear these presentations. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to introduce each of our speakers and give them about 5 minutes to kind of talk about how they're entering this space, the types of research and nature-based solutions that they are furthering, and then we'll have that group discussion. So I'm so excited to be able to introduce Secretary Wade Crowfoot, who served as California's Secretary for Natural Resources since January of 2019. He oversees an agency of 19,000 employees charged with protecting and managing California's diverse resources. The Secretary believes effective management of California's resources allows communities and natural places to thrive and the economy to grow. The Secretary is also prioritizing expanding access to parks and natural places and building California's resilience to climate-driven threats. The Secretary brings over 2 decades of public policy and environmental leadership to the office. He received his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Wisconsin here in the Midwest, and has earned a master's degree in public policy from the London School of Economics. Welcome, Secretary.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. Can you hear me?
We got you, yes.
Great, thanks so much. Well, it's great to be here, and I have to say Lord Goldsmith started it off in just such an energized, excellent way. I think we all are deeply thankful that the UK is leaning forward as it is on COP26, but then specifically to elevate nature-based solutions. He is absolutely right. Last month, our governor, Gavin Newsom, issued an executive order setting California policy and goal to conserve 30% of our state's land and coastal waters by 2030, to do our part for the 30 by 30 movement to protect 30% of the planet by 2030. And I won't repeat what Lord Goldsmith so eloquently summarized, but we all know that the stakes are as high as they could conceivably be at this point as it relates to climate change. And from our perspective, we haven't taken or utilized nature-based solutions enough as we race to zero carbon. If you think about it, we've all been so focused in recent decades on renewable energy generation, energy efficiency, transportation electrification. Those are all important pieces to reduce pollution, but we are literally sitting on solutions that will contribute to our race to zero and be an important way of the pie to carbon neutrality. And that is, of course, our natural and working lands. So we're really excited in California to formalize the priority for nature-based solutions, even as we reduce pollution in our building sector and our energy sector and our transportation. Countries and subnationals around the world are already utilizing their lands for economic benefit, whether it's farming or forestry or where communities are. We need to utilize our lands for carbon removal. And on the natural, these lands and waters absorb carbon from the atmosphere. But the question we're asking ourselves is, what more can we do on land management to sequester more carbon? And how can we better manage our lands to address the twin crises of climate change and mass extinction? We talk a lot about the planetary crisis of climate change, as we should, but we talk much less about the alarming loss of biodiversity across the planet. So the executive order that we issued in California not only sets that 30 by 30 target for our state, but also calls for an integrated strategy maximizing carbon removal from our lands. There's a lot of work that we need to do together on this, actually to learn from one another. And we learn from a lot of places in the world that are frankly ahead of us on nature-based solutions. Today, I want to just share briefly one example as a way to sort of galvanize us to demonstrate what can be done. So Nicholas, if you can move to my slides, that would be very helpful.
Sure thing, will do.
Great. So in California, probably much like other parts of the world, we have a diversity of landscapes. About 90% of our landmass is comprised of natural and working landscapes. So think forests, farms, rangeland for our cattle, natural areas, desert, and wetlands. And the example I want to provide today is on coastal wetlands. Wetlands are obviously important on our coast as sea level rises because they absorb storm surge and that sea level rise and form a buffer from impacts of sea level rise, and in California, worsening winter storms, which are called atmospheric rivers. So, Nicholas, I'm not yet seeing the slides, but I might not be seeing the same thing you are.
No, it's on our end. Just a second. I think they're coming up next.
Good. I'll keep on. I'll keep on talking. So from our perspective, there we go. Thanks, Nicholas. Restoration of wetlands really important, both as a carbon sink, because wetlands have scientifically demonstrated the strong capacity to absorb carbon, but then also again for that climate resilience. In this case on the coast, buffering against storm surge. And then importantly, preserving biodiversity. Some of our most threatened plants and animals are on our coasts. And we've lost about 95% of our wetlands in California as a result of industrial development over the last 150 years. So this is a project in the San Francisco Bay Area. And if you've ever flown into the San Francisco airport, you may have seen these strange looking geometric shapes at the southern portion of our very large San Francisco Bay. These are industrial salt ponds that were used to produce salt from saline water over time. And this project actually converted a very large portion of the salt ponds in what we call the South Bay from industrial use to managed natural wetlands. And this, I'll show a few slides of the before and after. This is, of course, on top the industrial wetland devoid the industrial salt lands devoid of life. And then within a decade, the conversion to wetlands. This has been a partnership of obviously the private sector in converting the land or selling the land to the public sector, and then the public sector managing this at several levels. So this is a close-up, obviously fairly intuitive, taking a landscape that had been denuded of natural hydrological flow in plants and animals to one that's full of them. Next slide. And in just 1 year, actually, in the first year of this conversion, this is the regeneration that was experienced. The same area captured by photo in just a year's time demonstrates the resilience of nature. If we allow nature actually to come back and to be restored, it will come back, and it will come back in a robust way. Next slide. And what we've learned in the last 10 years and what we expected is, again, not only does this increase significantly carbon removal from the atmosphere, but it's provided excellent habitat for nesting shorebirds. Next slide. We're seeing abundant life within these managed wetlands, which has been quite helpful because we are trying to manage many imperiled species, some of them shorebirds, those that are endangered, and that others that are declining. So as Lord Goldsmith talked about this portion of animals across the planet that have declined in population, we certainly have many of those on the west coast of the Americas. And so these large conversions or restoration of nature is providing a solution to bring back populations. Next slide. And of course, terrestrial animals as well, many which rely on these wetlands. And of course, when the wetlands were industrialized decades ago, there was not the scientific understanding of just the web of life that depends on these slide. So what we're seeing are an abundance of nature, birds, plants, animals that we hadn't seen in this portion of the Bay Area in decades. And again, not only does this benefit our biodiversity, it also increases our carbon removal. And I won't bore you with the numbers, but there's a bunch of scientific measurement of how we're increasing carbon removal by shifting land use patterns, and importantly, serving as a critical buffer from flooding in our South Bay, which is where our state Silicon Valley is located. Nicholas, I believe that's the last slide.
All right.
So let me conclude by saying just how excited we are to participate in the run-up to COP26, how excited we are to learn from our international partners, and frankly, how excited our governor is to join arm in arm with places around the world that are taking aggressive action to elevate and implement nature-based solutions as part of our collective race to zero carbon. Thanks so much.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm sure when we get into the discussion portion, we can talk a little bit in more detail about the governor's executive order, which is really great leadership here in the United States. And so, we've started this conversation. Well, and one thing I'd also just say that really struck me, Secretary, was the I had no idea 95% of wetland loss, and yet, as you said, the quick transformation when there's sort of focused resources and projects, which I take to be positive and makes me feel hopeful about this executive order.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And I would say this happens around the world. When we allow nature to flourish and regenerate, it will do so in remarkable ways.
Great. And thank you for bringing in the biodiversity. I know that's something that's very important that we at the UK are trying to do in mainstream. So what we're going to do now, we sort of started with a conversation from Lord Goldsmith talking about what national governments are doing, and then we had a great presentation from state leadership. And so what I think would be really helpful next is to sort of pivot to what's happening in the research space and what kinds of real life application that research has for nature-based solutions. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Judith Wolfe, who works with for the National Oceanography Centre in the UK as a physical oceanographer. Dr. Wolfe brings over 40 years of research and experience in her field, a graduate of Bangor University in Northern Wales with a joint honours degree in math and physical oceanography. And I should also note that she gained her PhD from Liverpool. She has a variety of research interests, but has been focusing on the Northwest European continental shelf, as well as global applications of wave models and shelf sea processes. Dr. Wolfe presently has research projects in the South China Sea and the Caribbean, which I think she's going to touch on with us today, exploring nature-based coastal defenses and the impact of climate change, including sea level rise. All right, over to you, Dr. Wolfe.
Thank you very much, Nick. Hopefully I'll see my slides in a second. Yes, thank you. Right, thank you very much for the opportunity to present our ANCODE project. This stands for Applying Nature-Based Coastal Defence to the World's Largest Urban Area from Science to Practice. Next slide, please. So the Pearl River Delta, which is where we are working, is actually the world's largest urban area. This is in China. In both size and population, it's a low-lying, flood-prone coastal environment exposed to sea level rise and extreme water levels caused by typhoons. And the question we're asking is whether restoration of the natural mangrove forest in that area is a realistic solution for nature-based coastal defence. I should just mention that 67 million people live in this delta region in 9 cities, including Hong Kong and Macau, as well as Guangzhou. So Guangzhou happens to be the city which is the most at risk. It has the largest annual losses from coastal flooding in the world. So mentioning this ANCODE project, I should say that it's a joint China, UK and Netherlands research project. It's been funded by the national research councils in each country. In the UK team, we are focusing on climate change projections, sea level and large area modelling. In the Netherlands, led by Dr. Tjeerd Boomer, we have a team who are mostly bringing their expertise in wetland ecology and mangrove mesocosm experiments. And in China, led by Dr. Zhan Hu, we have a team looking at remote sensing as well as in situ measurements and local area modelling. Next slide, please. I don't know. Oh, yes, that's right. This shows our team on our first trip to the field site at Hailing Island in China in February 2018. Next slide. This is us examining the mangrove restoration project at Hailing Island. Next slide, please. So the conceptual model that we're looking at is how can mangroves enhance the coast protection in an urbanized delta? So the sort of little cartoon at the top is showing you if you have a seawall that can actually still be threatened and damaged by particularly typhoon events with large waves and sea level rise and storm surges, as already been mentioned. However, if you can plant some mangroves in front of that seawall, you get an enhanced defence, which could, it looks like initially in the short term it costs money, but in the longer term it may save money because it's protecting the seawalls, which are extremely expensive coastal defence measures. And at the bottom, it's just showing a conceptual model of the project, whereby we're looking at the effects of climate change through atmospheric modelling, looking at global warming, sea level rise and changing storminess, and how that impacts on an area like the Pearl River Delta, where we're bringing different external forces to bear, sea level rise, storm surges, and also changing river discharge, as well as temperatures. And then on to local area, actually how the sediments have changed, how the mangroves can be re-established, and what suitable habitats exist in that area. Next slide, please. So these are just a very rough a quick look at some assorted results from the project. One thing I wanted to bring out was in the top left-hand panel, you can see the cost of coastal flooding as a percentage of GDP, and this calculation has been made for China. So on the left of the figure, you're seeing present day, and it may be less than 2% of GDP. But under worst case scenarios, on the right hand side of that figure, you've got 2100, where the cost of protection from coastal flooding, or the cost of losses which aren't protected, could be as much as 15% of GDP. And it does depend on climate scenarios, but the purple line is our business as usual scenario if we do nothing. The middle top shows the extent of the model that we've established for this area, which has high resolution within the delta and coarse resolution outside on the South China Sea coastal shelf. The bottom left is showing the work being done by the satellite team in China, who are estimating the changing mangrove cover in the area. In the middle, we have, at the bottom, we have a sort of summary of the work being done by our Netherlands team on looking at stresses on mangroves, in particular, how repeated storms might exacerbate the problem for establishing new seedlings. And at the bottom right, we've got the new sensors that have been developed by our China team for measuring surface elevation sediments, and above the proposed sensor network in the delta. Next slide, please. And so this is just showing some of the selection of papers that we published, but pointing out that the project website at the top, if anyone follows this up later, will give more information on all of this. Next slide, please. And there may be an animation which can run here, just showing it's a view flyover of the mangrove restoration site at Hiling Island. Possibly doesn't play, but not to worry. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Judith. That was really helpful. And I have a couple questions too related to the mangrove, but we'll just because we're slightly behind, I'm going to hold my question until we get to the discussion. Okay, so moving right along, what we want to do next is we have a great example at the local level from the city of Encinitas. And so I'm excited to introduce Jamie Timberlake, who's the Coastal Zone Program Administrator. She runs a variety of shoreline protection programs and is currently working on design, permitting, and installation of a native habitat restoration project on the bluff slopes of Bacon's Beach. But what Ms. Timberlake's here to talk to us today is about her work as project manager of the award-winning Cardiff State Beach Living Shoreline project, which we're going to get into in just a moment. The project was developed in cooperation with GHD, who I believe are joining us as well today, the California Department of Parks and Recreation, the Coastal Conservancy, UCLA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Nature Collective. Prior to that, Ms. Timberlake worked for about 11 years for DUDEC and became specialized in habitat restoration and environmental analysis with specific emphasis on coastal zone projects. She holds a bachelor's degree in environmental science and geography from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a master's degree in marine affairs and policy from the University of Miami Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. Welcome, Jamie.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great.
And we can see you. Great.
Okay, great. Well, you can go ahead and start the slides now, and I'll just run with it. Hello, thank you for having me on this amazing panel. As Nicholas mentioned, my name is Jamie Timberlake, and I'm the Coastal Zone Program Administrator for the City of Encinitas. My work at the city primarily involves anything related to shoreline stabilization, so usually large beach nourishment projects. But lately, I've been getting involved in engineering projects on the coast, trying to encourage coastal resilience and ecology into the design of traditional capital improvement projects. The Cardiff Living Shoreline is an excellent example of this type of project that restores and protects coastal ecosystems while providing traditional flood abatement. Before launching into the details, I just want to thank all the collaborators that made this project come to fruition. They're all at the bottom of the slide here. Encinitas is very lucky to have their continued support. Next slide, please. So the Cardiff Living Shoreline project, substantially completed in June 2019, is a constructed sand dune system that protects Highway 101 for the design life of the project, or about 30 years. It's considered a pilot project because it veers away from more traditional coastal armoring, and it created an East Coast style beach dune system to provide a natural buffer for the road. The Cardiff Living Shoreline is one of only a few nature-based resilience projects on our high wave energy coast. So we are closely monitoring the dunes in hopes that we may provide coastal practitioners with a better understanding of the engineering and the effectiveness of this type of more natural shoreline protection system. After about 8 months of construction, we now have a 60-foot wide, roughly 3,000 foot long dune system that has successfully protected Highway 101 thus far from high wave events, and it's recreated historic dune habitat. Next slide, please. So prior to the installation of the Living Shoreline, this stretch of road experienced wave overtopping, consistent annual flooding, and extreme erosion on the beach. After each storm event, the city had to restack the riprap, or at a minimum block the road, patch any damage, and this type of ad hoc maintenance continued to happen over and over. Even after a large beach nourishment project placed about a few 100,000 cubic yards of sand at Cardiff, shown here in this 2012 photo, it was evident that the years of wave action had significantly damaged the stacked riprap that was protecting the highway. So something more long-term needed to be done before the ocean was again lapping at the sides of the highway. Next slide, please. The Cardiff Living Shoreline started out as just a large berm, a refuge for dredged sand from the restoration effort that was underway in the nearby San Alejo Lagoon. But though this initial idea was scratched, it brought together several stakeholders, including the city, the Coastal Conservancy, Coastal Commission, and state parks, each with their own individual needs and wants for a sand berm project. This began shaping the project design and the objectives. So the main objectives of this project are first and foremost to protect Highway 101 from the consistent flooding that it was already experiencing. Second, create rare historic dune habitat, supporting species common to dunes in the neighboring lagoon. And third, improve the beach access and the overall beach experience. Next slide, please. So in January 2019, the construction of the project began, and here are some installation shots. Though based upon nature, the Living Shoreline dunes needed to be somewhat armored or constructed. Dunes made only of sand and native plants migrate and naturally accrete and erode. in this confined area, the dunes needed to be anchored to meet the first objective. So the riprap that was previously stacked was repurposed and trenched. In the process of trenching, cobblestone was extracted and then repositioned to provide a protective toe along the ocean front of the dune. And then sand from the San Alejo Lagoon Inlet, shown in the bottom middle picture, which was the last piece of the overall lagoon restoration project. It was then obtained and used to bury the stacked revetment and the cobble. And finally, in the spring and fall of 2019, native plants grown from seed from the local watershed were planted on the dunes, and the dunes were complete. Next slide, please. So today, the Living Shoreline has completed 1 year of the long-term monitoring, and it's been meeting all of its performance standards. No wave overtopping has occurred. In fact, there's been limited wave run-up on the dunes to date. The planted dune species are establishing well, and with increased plants, we're expecting to see improved sand retention on the dunes and perhaps some notable accretion. This rare coastal habitat is already a wildlife refuge. Western snowy plover were observed just this week using the dunes during high tide events. Additionally, there is abundant use of the Living Shoreline project by a myriad of beach users, including walkers and runners, families, birders, surfers. Though this project was not without its hiccups, the multiple benefits provided by the Living Shoreline have enabled continued support from the public and its stakeholders, which gives us another insight into how to create a persevering coastal resilience building project. And that's all from me.
Excellent. Wow. Talk about a win-win. This is very exciting. Great. All right. Well, we're going to move right into our, thank you, Jamie. We're going to move right in quickly into our last speaker. So now kind of pivoting to the private sector for a really great pilot project. I'm excited to introduce to all of you Ben Cutler. He's the Director of Special Projects at Microsoft. And so, sorry, just needed to grab here. Ben leads the Microsoft project called Nautic, which is an underwater data center effort. Previously, he worked at DARPA, where he managed Insight, a multi-source, multi-sensor information fusion program that was adopted by various defense agencies and by the U.S. Army as its next generation battlefield intelligence system. Wow. Prior to DARPA, Ben led the development of media and mobile technologies for a next generation Microsoft operating system. And earlier in his career, he was a founder of and an early employee of successful startups in supercomputing, semiconductors, and consumer electronics. Ben has advanced degrees in computer science from both Yale University and New York University. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, good morning or good afternoon. Can everybody hear me?
We can.
Excellent. Next slide. So Project Nautic is an exploration of manufactured underwater data centers, and we had a couple technical objectives here. One is to provide new options to deploy to challenging locations more rapidly with less resource intensity. And it's also a laboratory for exploring new technologies, in particular this idea of lights out data centers that operate without human intervention for very long periods of time. In our case, we operated for more than 2 years and demonstrated we had 8 times the reliability of land data centers, which means this concept is both technically and economically viable. So Microsoft typically works with a community of partners on both product and research work. And in this case, we partnered with Naval Group of France to develop the data center, the European Marine Energy Center in the UK to host the deployment, and the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab, which is one of 3 ocean centers of excellence in the United States, to provide expert guidance. Next slide. So this is the phase 2 data center that we deployed off Scotland. We actually deployed a smaller one off the coast of California back in 2015. This data center is completely compatible with our existing IT equipment. In fact, it's running the same servers that we run in our land data centers. We have a higher energy efficiency than any other commercial or experimental data center. So the overhead here is about 7% for cooling the data center. In contrast, land data centers typically are 20% or 50% or higher. So we use much less energy to operate. And for cooling, we actually use seawater, not fresh water, as buildings on land typically do. And so this entire data center, including the servers, also are recyclable. Next slide, please. So I mentioned EMEC, European Marine Energy Center, and in part we chose Europe because it's the world leader in offshore renewable energy today. 29 of the 30 largest offshore wind farms are located there. And as you may know, EMEC is the premier testbed for ocean energy devices today. Environmental sustainability is a key focus for us, and the grid that we're on there is 100% renewable energy. Part of our goal, as I mentioned, is rapid deployment. And so this data center was in the water and operational 30 days after it left the factory. In comparison, a more typical data center takes up to 18 months to build. It's a construction project. Next slide, please. So we like this idea, the concept of co-locating our data centers with renewable energy, and in this case, offshore wind, as the truest form of green energy and with best reliability, both because we really know where the power is coming from, and we also have the least infrastructure between the source and the data center. So this is a map of Europe today, and about 20 gigawatts of offshore wind right now from the top 5 countries. And all those little polygons there are wind projects, and the only ones in really dark blue are operational. So you can see there's this enormous amount of renewable energy that's coming. And interestingly, many of these wind farms are going up near major population centers. So for us, it's a way not just to co-locate with the renewable energy source, but also get close to our customers for lower latency. And that supports services like Microsoft Teams or Xbox or factory automation or many of the other new applications that are coming along and are enabled by 5G telecommunications. Next slide. So for this project, our thesis was that we could provide this effective environment for reliable lights operation for servers, and we've seen that with substantially lower failure rates than in land data centers. So this talk is about not per se a nature-based solution, but perhaps more one that's nature aware. So next slide. So we had cameras in the data center, both inside and out, and we actually put the external ones live on our website. There was a large audience of people who watch these things, some of them for hours. Some people put it up as their screensaver, and we know this because whenever the cameras went down, we get this flood of emails asking when they'd come back. So that was kind of an interesting social experiment. But truthfully, the reason we put the cameras up was for transparency. We want to be very open about what we're doing and how we're doing it on this project. Next slide. So we also used AI. And so one of the things that we did is we had lots of fish. And so we built a fish detector. And this actually became the basis of a project that turned into a customer offering that understood different species of fish. And so it allowed the customer basically to have a towed camera that they towed from a ship through some area that was sensitive and be able to sort of, go there frequently, and it would automatically count fish of different species and help them understand when they're surveying how healthy the environment was. Next slide. So one of the things that we have spent a lot of thought on actually is this idea of subsea data centers as artificial reefs, and do they act that way and what happens? And so Dr. Andrew Want of Heriot-Watt University did an assessment of the biofouling on this vessel in Scotland after it came out after 2 years. And the upper right is the vessel, and to the uninformed eye like mine, it just looks like a bunch of barnacles. But there are all sorts of species that resided in or near this data center besides fish. So oysters, anemones, coral, squid, a bunch of other stuff. Next slide. We even had some larger folks who came and visited every now and then, like this character here. So I think a key element is that as we're performing research, as we're doing with Project Natick, we're doing that to learn and inform any future steps company. So we would never go to scale on something like this unless we truly understood what we were doing. Next slide. And so Project Natick is really just an example of one of many different things going on at Microsoft, where we're performing research to creatively reimagine the cloud, because that's where a lot of the growth is right now, and to do this in ways that bring it to our customers in ever more environmentally sustainable ways. And just in closing, I just want to note that across Microsoft, there's lots of things that we're doing. We've made big commitments in carbon and in water and in waste, and I'll put the links in the chat. But we have, for example, a $1 billion fund for innovation in carbon reduction and carbon elimination. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ben. And I really appreciated that connection, how you've kind of seamlessly brought in offshore wind. So there's a renewable energy component, and then also the positives around biodiversity as well. So a really great project. Very good. Well, thank you all again to our four speakers. Again, we were very intentional in trying to make sure that we were highlighting that these nature-based solutions are kind of across all of society. This is not just something that government is working on, but those governments that are, it can be something that cities can do, that states, and of course, both at the national level as well. So what we're going to do is we were very intentional in calling this a roundtable, not a webinar panel, because we do want this to be interactive. That being said, we do have a number of people in Microsoft Teams right now, so we do need to have this be facilitated. So we're going to ask that if you have questions, that you please use the hand function, and then when I call on you, we'll ask that you unmute yourself. You're also welcome, if you're uncomfortable asking your question out loud, you're welcome to put it into the chat box, and my colleague David and I will do our best to kind of summarize and ask those questions and direct them to specific speakers. And again, just a reminder to stay muted when you're not asking a question, and if you could try and keep your questions brief, just because we get to as many questions as possible. If it's all right, though, as purview of the moderator, I am going to ask my first question, ask the first question. And as someone who went to school at UC San Diego, I can't help but geek out a little bit on California's 30 by 30. And so if it's all right, this first question is going to be directed to the secretary. And I just hope you could maybe comment on the fact that we heard that Lord Goldsmith talk about that underinvestment in nature-based solutions globally, and how the UK is trying to make efforts to increase that financing and has made commitments to do so. But I just think that, like many public endeavors, resources are finite. And so was hoping that you could maybe comment on how California is approaching resourcing your 30 by 30 initiative, and especially in the context of financial constraints due to the pandemic and the horrific wildfires.
Yeah, that's a great 30 by 30 movement, internationally is a goal to protect 30% of the planet by 2020. And California stepped up with this executive order and some saying we are going to achieve our part in California, both for lands and coastal water. And so, in California, we've been able to finance considerable transition to low carbon economy as a result of our cap and trade program. And so part of that cap and trade, which we call the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, is shifting into these nature-based. So that's forest resilience projects that reduce catastrophic wildfire risk, which is a huge deal, obviously, in California. It's a healthy soils program to partner with farmers to get more organic content in the soil to both absorb carbon and retain water. It's funding for urban greening, actually, that has multiple benefits in very urbanized parts of California that don't have green space. But those, obviously, that greening and those trees absorb carbon. And then it's expanding and restoring wetlands and natural areas. So I would say we've spent, upwards of about $250 million in the last decade on these, and we're scaling up, certainly using our, our trade program. I'll also say, though, part of this is is about improving current land management practices. So we have a robust agriculture industry. And so what we're talking about is helping that agriculture actually continue to improve land management, to grow crops, to ensure economic prosperity, but also to build in more environmental conservation. We have an easement program, for example, to encourage the pollinators, the bees, to actually flourish on the farms in California. That can sound like a small issue, but it's actually really important from a biodiversity perspective. So Nicholas, I think part of this is, yes, making sure that some of our climate budget is not only going into transportation, electrification, renewable energy, but it's applied to these nature-based solutions. But I think it's also these partnerships where we're bringing private sector land managers together and helping figure out what is the best way to optimize carbon removal without sacrificing the economic use of those lands.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Really helpful. I'm going to do one last question just to make sure we bring in our full set of speakers, and then glad to see so many hands and questions. For any of you that want to come in on this, Jamie, maybe if you want to start off, but anyone else, feel free to. What I hope we come away with is how we make this scalable. And so I wonder if any of our speakers could comment on, what do you see as the low-hanging fruit? I think many of you have already touched on this in your presentations. What are the things that the nature-based solutions that a city or a state could implement tomorrow if they wanted to? And then maybe what are the areas that are going to take more time, steps that are needed to make nature-based solutions a key pillar of solving the climate change? What are sort of our short-term ways to scale up, and then things that maybe take longer? So Jamie, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that that Encinitas, I think, has done well is that we've separated out climate resilience staff. So anyone who's working on a proactive or a climate resilient type project will work sort of independently of other aspects of how the city is run. So like, for instance, the Climate Action Program Administrator for the city works specifically on objectives that are set forth in the Climate Action Program. Similarly, like on a normal day-to-day basis, I don't work on permitting of individual projects. I work on a wider time scale on a coastal resilience building projects that are expected to last for many decades. And so I think it's really a good idea to have these sorts of roles be taken on by someone individually per municipality, because it's really necessary to have someone kind of be the showrunner for these types of projects. Cities are traditionally more reactive. And so for these types of like pilot projects or proactive projects, projects in the face of uncertainty, it really helps to have like your cheerleader, your showrunner that can kind of integrate this into existing types of projects. So that's just one. It seems pretty low hanging to me.
Great. No, thank you. Anyone else want to come in? Any of our speakers?
Nicholas, I will say, I think something we need to do, and we can really collaborate across jurisdiction, is measuring the benefits of nature-based solutions, specifically carbon removal. I think that there has, been improved science recently about how much carbon our lands absorb. But, if we think about maximizing, land use policy to remove carbon from the atmosphere, you can't manage what you don't measure. In other words, if we're really talking about trying to build this into our carbon neutrality targets, we need to be able to measure how improved land management actually will benefit our race to zero. So we don't have all the answers on that. We're still working on that, but I think developing methodologies to measure carbon removal and then create consistencies, across jurisdictions and institutions would be very helpful.
Great. Judith, do you want to maybe comment on that or something related in sort of the wave space?
Yeah, thank you. I would just like to say that although we're coming at this from a science point of view and sort of a bit earlier than the sort of implementation phase, which it's great to see so many people are obviously tackling the actual building of stuff. We are really positive about the fact that nature-based solutions for reintroducing wetlands will be great for the fact is that wetlands are a great sink for carbon. And also what we're doing is reducing the amount of concrete that we're going to put on the coast, because concrete is unfortunately a big emitter of carbon. So I think that many of the solutions that are being talked about are really win-win.
Great, good point. Ben, just want to offer you a chance before I move on.
I think, you know, in general, as we look at things, we're always looking at, you know, there's traditional ways that we've built things, whether it be buildings or data centers or other architecture. And so ways that we can do things that are more environmentally friendly ways. And that really means looking at things over the whole life expectancy. And so, for example, when we think about supply chain, so it's not just what we, Microsoft, do, but what do our vendors do when they're, for example, designing a server? What is that process like? What is their footprint like? And actually reaching out across the whole ecosystem to our vendors and to our customers to help them in their goals. And so, you know, very simple things like a customer can see how much carbon they're using by using our data center versus a normal data center, but just really sort of working collaboratively with customers, whether they be businesses or governments, to sort of jointly sort of work on environmental goals that we mutually share to sort of get us in a better place.
Okay, great. So next, I'd like to go to Shasta, who has a question, I think an important question, on what this means for Indigenous communities. Shasta?
Hello, good morning. My name is Dr. Shasta Gaughan. I am the Environmental Director and also the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Paula Band of Mission Indians, which is located in San Diego County in California. And given that this is a discussion of nature-based solutions to climate change, it seems to me that a discussion of Indigenous participation is essential. And in California in particular, that's where I'm based, I work with a lot of colleagues, especially in Northern California, with tribes that are reintroducing some traditional land management practices into fire management. So things like controlled burning that has been done for millennia by tribes to encourage the growth of subsistence species and create habitat for animals that might be hunted or for fish to maintain the streams. And so given that Lord Goldsmith in particular, he talked about how many people subsist still on these natural lands and these natural systems. In what ways, and this is for any of you, in what ways are you considering Indigenous land management practices as part of your efforts to mitigate and manage climate change?
Yeah, thanks so much, Shasta. This is Wade. It's an excellent question and an important point. The way we think about this in California is our tribal communities have been conserving our nature since time immemorial. And so it would be foolish of us to expand nature-based solutions without centralizing sort of their leadership and knowledge, that so-called traditional ecological knowledge. And we're having a really interesting, evolving conversation around co-management of nature and natural areas and our natural resources. Because as I've been educated, it's not a situation where, state government or federal government would simply appropriate that knowledge. It has to be done in partnership. But Shasta's absolutely right. I mean, there are practices, traditional practices like this prescribed burning that frankly was outlawed by our state government over a century ago, and it's resulted in the catastrophic wildfire that we're seeing today. So I think as we evolve this conversation leading up to COP26, we should definitely integrate, tribal leadership and tribal perspectives, or what I think we know internationally as Indigenous perspectives, because they really point the way to the future. I think last point, I've been educated by our tribal partners that, nature is not about separating people from the land or from plants and animals. People have a role in conserving nature, and certainly people have a role in nature-based solutions. So when we talk about these, like the salt ponds I showed, people have a role in that, not only in resource management, like biologists, but they actually expand access. Those salt ponds have recreational access. So, we can actually advance nature-based solutions in a way that benefit people with the wisdom of our Indigenous partners.
Thank you, Wade. Anyone else want to come in on that question? Okay, great. Well, next, let's take a question from Eileen Maher. And also if folks could introduce who they're with, that would be really helpful.
Thank you. My name is Eileen Maher, and I'm the Director of Environmental Conservation, which includes aquaculture and blue tech for the Port of San Diego. The port is a huge advocate for nature-based solutions. And to meet these goals, the port has completed over 400 acres of wetland restoration from former salt ponds in the South San Diego Bay. And we're currently working on 5 nature-based solution projects, including 3D ocean farming, a living shoreline, nature-based solutions for shoreline structures, wetlands mitigation banking, creating habitat, and then working with a seaweed company. So my question is for everyone, but specifically Secretary Crowfoot, what are your thoughts on how California's 30-30 plan will look specifically for the ocean and wetlands?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I think as different jurisdictions across the world advance 30 by 30 or try to figure out how they can support the broad 30 by 30 movement, there's an open question around, how do we conserve land and coastal waters in a way that's actually workable for communities and economic activity? So, we use the word conserve versus protect because we think conserve infers that there are ways to utilize the lands, protect biodiversity, sequester carbon, and allow for other uses. And it's not about separating, people or activity from nature, but it's about ensuring that whatever activity is in that land or that water is actually conserving the nature. So as it relates to wetlands and coasts, I don't want to make this too California-centric, my answer, but the short of it is, we already have a marine protected area network in California. We're really proud. It's sort of like we think it's an international model of over 100 connected protected areas. And so that's going to be reviewed in 2022 to determine its efficacy and its impacts on the fishing industry. And so it could be that our MPA network is modified or expands, but that remains to be seen. But then it's also about, are there other ways that we can improve conservation actually on those coastal waters? In the United States, our state waters are from the tide line, essentially the beach, out 3 miles. So we're going to be looking to understand how do we improve conservation. And then wetlands, I think, our goal is to restore as many coastal wetlands as we can. One of the challenges is, property in California is really expensive, particularly on the coast. So where we can work with cities like Encinitas and other places to actually improve the coastal environment, while maintaining its use, we'll need to. Some of them will be full-on restoration projects like are happening in San Diego and the Bay. Others will be simply improving, coastal environments to not necessarily to change their use or make them environmental preserves, but to ensure that they're actually achieving environmental benefits.
Thank you.
Great. And I like that nuance on conservation versus protection. I think so much of the work we do in this space, can get polarized because of sometimes the language or the misperception, that working lands can have these win-win solutions for climate, for the economy, for communities. So I think that was an excellent point. And so glad to see so many hands. I'm going to go next to Shimrit, if you'd like to come in.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to see this great enthusiasm around nature-based solutions. My name is Shimrit Pekolfinko. I'm the co-founder and CEO of eConcrete, calling in from Israel, Tel Aviv. My question is kind of general around locations where we cannot really work with living shorelines and softer solutions, like in urbanized waterfronts and city waterfronts. This is where my work comes in, when we are actually taking concrete infrastructure and we're helping them support a much more diverse and healthier ecosystem through ecological engineering. It's kind of greening the gray. At the moment, there's not a lot of legislation that actually supports these types of initiatives. So my question is, what can we do in order to advance the capacity to implement new technologies in this space, if it's in the form of releasing some of the permitting or mitigation requirements for projects that are including nature-inclusive features as a part of the actual infrastructure works? Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to jump in. Your point is well taken. You know, nature-based solutions work in some contexts, but not all contexts. I'll give you an example. Urban San Francisco has a waterfront that is threatened by sea level rise. You're not going to be able to put a living shoreline on the San Francisco waterfront. It's going to involve, you know, concrete. And so, you know, can we rebuild that waterfront or protect that waterfront, reducing the carbon intensivity of concrete, for example, using more environmentally beneficial concrete, and or, you know, armor that waterfront in ways that benefit nature. So it's not just something we would have planned or built, you know, 40 years ago, but we're utilizing that hardscape, but in a more appropriate way. I think your point is your question is a really good one around how can we be incentivizing that. I'm intrigued about the notion of it being some type of environmental mitigation, so that there's an economic incentive to use this type of product or this type of approach. So, you know, enabling it to be environmental mitigation, creating, for example, you know, ultimate in the beginning incentives or preferences for projects or for this type of material being used in projects, and then ultimately maybe at some point in the future, if it's cost, you know, if the cost is competitive, you know, requiring it as a building material. So in California, we're pretty experienced with that curve around helping technologies flourish, enabling them as pilots, incentivizing early use, and then moving to standardize the use. So just really interested in seeing this move forward.
Absolutely, and I'll just finish with a small comment that we're actually working with the Port of San Diego under the Blue Economy program, and we already have the first installation of some of our technologies in the port happening just this month. So I see great potential for application of nature-based and nature-inspired solution to help offset some of those construction works impact. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, next I'm going to call on Richard Kai, and again, apologies to all of you for if I'm butchering anyone's name. Oh, and before we go to Richard, just one comment. I noticed several questions directed to Lord Goldsmith. He unfortunately had to run before we could get to the discussion portion, so we'll feed those questions back to him. I know he expressed an interest in responding, so we'll help facilitate that. To you, Richard, with your question.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning. This is a question for Secretary Proudfoot. My name is Richard Kai, and I'm the president of the Institute of the Americas, which is on the UCSD campus. My question has to do with the potential for cross-border protection of migratory species. In the case of California, California has many migratory species that it shares with Mexico and Canada. To the extent that California is now doing cap and trade, what opportunities are there for protecting mangroves, in Mexico, for example, that could lead to some cap and trade opportunities for California-based companies to mitigate their carbon emissions, at the same time protecting migratory species that are of importance to California?
Thanks so much, Richard. I mean, I think it's a really interesting point around, as we work within our own jurisdictions to protect biodiversity and sort of help restore nature, we have to remember that a lot of these animals, you know, don't live in jurisdictions. In California, we're part of the Pacific Flyway, which we think is one of the largest annual migrations of life from the Arctic to Mexico and in some cases South America, where birds are moving up and down the Pacific. So I can't give you that intelligent answer around what are the solutions to ensure the viability of those heavily migrating populations. But I know that there has been work with both Canada and Mexico on that. And some of our policy deputies are listening in today, Richard. So it would be great to sort of deepen the conversation, because to the extent that you're sort of coordinating partnerships with other countries in the Americas, it would be great to talk more about what we can be doing on migratory species. The question around could sort of restoration projects like coastal mangrove projects in other countries qualify for, the offset market within cap and trade? That's a fairly technical question. I think it's one that we can help you answer. I'm not sure, quite frankly, about sort of the status of the offset program to be able to do that. But I'll ask my colleague Amanda, who's listening, to take your name and to get in touch to further the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, just to, so you know, California under Governor Jerry Brown did a pilot project with Chiapas, and it was in the rainforest there. So I think that if you look at some of the habitats that California is closer linked with down the Baja Peninsula as well as Sea Cortez with migratory bird species, there might be some interesting opportunities to achieve some dual objectives.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, next going to bring in Tom Burbeck with a question or comment.
Hi everyone, great to be here. My name is Tom Burbeck. I'm the CEO and co-founder of our marine eco-engineering company, specialising in accelerating reef creation, focusing on offshore wind sites at the moment. I have a question for Ben Cutler. Really interesting presentation, Ben, on the Nomadic project. I was wondering, you mentioned and showed some footage of a software that was able to detect the species and abundance of certain fish. Is this a software that you're looking to develop as part of the project and maybe license this to other companies? I ask because we do a lot of subsea monitoring of our reef systems, and software like that would be really useful to cut down hours and hours of watching through our review footage.
So that is something where our technology was taken by a partner company and developed into a product that they offer, and it's actually used in Australia. Drop me a note at natick@microsoft.com and I'll see if I can kind of hunt them down for you.
That'd be great, thank you.
All right, excellent. We are just going through these questions. I'm going to bring in Gillian next.
Thanks, Nicholas. It's Gillian, but Gillian works.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's on the line. I'll understand the name. It's a bit more common in in the UK. I work for GHD. We're an engineering firm based down here in San Diego. My colleague Brian is on the line as well. We're actually supporting the city on the Cardiff project. So interested in that side of things. I'm going to push it back a little bit to what we talked about and what Wade was mentioning on how does this audience feel about incentivizing more the private sector and the private entities into implementing these types of projects? When we're looking at government type agencies, state agencies, federal government, it's a little easier to put our arms around it. But how do we feel that we incentivize the private entities? As we touched on California, which we have a lot, right? Wade mentioned the fishing industry, mentioned coastal properties and the prices of living here. It's a big part of the US in the land ownership model. So how do we do that on the private sector side?
Well, it's a really good, it's a good question, and it's probably one we need to unpack. I think, from our perspective, we see significant opportunities for private investment in nature-based solutions. And it obviously depends on sort of, okay, if it's not philanthropic, in other words, the private sector simply granting funding, there need to be, revenue streams. And from our perspective, part of the work we need to do on nature-based solutions is quantifying the benefits and monetizing the benefits. So, for example, if there is significant amounts of carbon being removed or increases in carbon removal as a result of agricultural practices that put more, compost into the soil, can we create for agricultural producers a revenue stream to do that? And in California, because we have the cap and trade program, we have sort of monetized carbon, and so there is sort of revenue streams for this. Likewise, a lot of these nature-based solutions benefit water supply and water quality, so could be advanced by water agencies that are thinking, in a more innovative way than just investing in sort of traditional gray infrastructure. So in other words, forest resilience, like if you actually get in there and do prescribed burning in forests and or, thin forests to ecologically beneficial levels, it actually helps water supply of agencies that rely on that forested watershed as sort of the headwaters of their system. And so can you actually generate revenue investment for entities to be able to do that? Ultimately, what I'd like to see, and this is just sort of me talking, is like pay for performance, where we're actually not granting out or complementing grants with going to the private sector and saying, we want this amount of carbon absorption, we want this outcome in water, we're willing to pay this amount of money for it. We're starting to do some of that with our state water system, and it's working. But it does require sort of new frameworks and models because it's not the traditional way that government operates.
Yeah. Thank you. Very fascinating. I definitely, we're on the downstream end of the design and, helping to find clients with funding mechanisms. So, having that support or that outlook is really useful. Looking at, like you were saying there's brokerage type deals of where you can incentivize with, if you move in this direction or invest in this direction, there could be benefits for you in the long term. So thank you. Fascinating.
Thanks, Jillian. Really appreciate that. Okay, just to make sure we bring in the rest of the panel, I did want to kind of, I think we've, celebrate a lot of success and great case studies today, but I think it's also important to acknowledge some of the challenges, and certainly we've heard about just sort of what's happening to our planet, but what I mean is the challenges to kind of scale up nature-based solutions. So I was wondering if, where do each of you see areas for improvement? Is it a matter of, technological? Is it resource and financing? Perhaps policies are creating barriers? Or is it more just, public will and making sure that we, kind of reach those individuals that aren't, working in this space like all of us? What should this group of leaders be focused on addressing in the next year and in the next decade? So, maybe I'd like to start with Judith, and then we'll go to Jamie. We'll kind of work our way back up to California.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, challenges. Yes, there are technological challenges. But we know about the climate issues that basically I think we are now accepting we have to start immediately. We cannot wait any longer. I've been working on climate related issues for 20 years and we're still saying similar things. So the challenges are partly the will to do this. And if we have that will, political will, and we're prepared to put the money into it, I think we can overcome some of the challenges. For the kind of area that I was talking about, reintroduction of mangroves, one of the challenges and what we're trying to answer some of these questions for people who might implement it, what size of mangrove area do you need in order for it to be resilient enough to establish itself? So, that's just one example of where we still need scientific knowledge. And as it's been said by several people, that nature will actually re-establish given a chance. But if we're in a very highly urbanized area already, what do we need to do to make this work? It's still not fully clear. I'm delighted to hear so many great ideas about, eco-concrete and others. So I think we just need to get a move on and actually follow up these commitments that have often been made, and we need to see them happening.
Well said. Thank you. Jamie?
Hi, well, Shimrit and I are actually chatting on the side over here because I think one of the most difficult things, like for cities who are on the forefront of all these coastal and climate resilience projects, we're financially challenged, and we often have to take the lowest bidder for these types of coastal projects, and so that's really, really difficult because oftentimes the best product isn't the least costing one. So I think grants are really important, and that we should continue to enable cities and enable municipalities to go for grants, because those are definitely a way to get other people involved and excited about a project, even if they're not 100% behind a coastal resilience type project that involves, ecology and all those things. But free projects, everyone can get behind.
Great, thank you. Ben, anything from the private sector perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's honestly, at this point, it's a matter of will and the willingness to go and do things. I mean, if you look at sort of wind power has become very inexpensive now. There's some challenges in terms of storage to sort of level things out. And like Microsoft, for our part with data centers, are involved in the energy markets and trying to help stabilize grids. As we get greater renewables, it's harder to stabilize grids. And just inside the company, there's a tax on energy. Every organization has a tax on the energy it uses, and then that tax goes to a fund to help develop new innovation. So that both helps drive down energy use as well as sort of facilitate innovation. And so I think it's just a matter of will. And I think to the degree that the public sees climate as an issue, that companies, the private sector, will just naturally respond to it. So we're ahead of many companies, but I think even if you look at oil and gas companies, some of them have switched in part or entirely in some cases over to purely renewables as what they market and what they do. And so I think everybody's got a part to play here, and it's just a matter of incentivization and willpower on society to make it happen.
I think that's really well said, and yes, I mean, we're seeing that in the auto space. Ford is making huge announcements and investments and partnering with California and elsewhere. Utility companies are making pledges. So yeah, I think we are kind of hopefully at that tipping point. Secretary, do you want to come in with maybe the last comment?
Sure. So over 20 years ago, I worked in the city and county of San Francisco when electric vehicles were, fairly new and certainly not mainstream. And we started, playing around with sort of how do we incentivize electric vehicles. And you look at now 20 years later, the UK, I believe, announced a vision to require that all new vehicles are zero emission, in a decade. So we've seen, different solutions in the climate space go from sort of the exotic ideas to the piloted to the mainstream. And we need to do the same with nature-based solutions. It has been fairly compartmented. It didn't exist in the conversation at COPs probably a decade ago, and it's gotten some discussion. But we have to make nature-based solutions not a nice to have, but a must-have in our climate solutions. And a lot of it involves a lot of things, but one of them is continuing to demonstrate, good projects on the ground. So whether it's, mangroves to protect Guangzhou or, a living shoreline to protect, coastal Southern California and Encinitas, we need to demonstrate that these solutions work to protect us, to remove carbon, to provide other benefits. And then we need to mainstream them so that in 10 years, every city, state, province, federal government has an approach on nature-based solutions and is optimizing nature-based solutions to meet its carbon goals. I think we can get there. And frankly, I think more conversations like this move us in that direction.
Excellent last point to end on. I know we're a few minutes over, but very much agree about that mainstreaming and building those connections that we can have win-wins that benefit biodiversity, that help against the climate crisis, and that also are good for communities and our economy. So well said. I think this conversation is a start, and we will keep it going. And the UK is committed to this effort and making sure that nature is a crucial component to COP26. So we are over. I'm going to have to leave it there. We know there were other hands raised and some questions in the chat box. We'll do our best to follow up. If I could just have the slides come back up to put my colleagues' contact information up there. If you have any additional questions or you want more information about COP26, please contact David Pasquini. He's our consul at our UK government office in San Diego. As a reminder, we did record this, and we will be posting that recording to the TMA Blue Tech YouTube channel shortly. So let's see, there's that contact information, that email there. So again, please reach out to us. Thank you so much to all 4 of our presenters, really experts in their field. And thank you all for our participants and your feedback and questions as well. Everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Nicholas.